What if the most powerful way to challenge a narcissistic person is not by fighting back, proving your point, or exposing them? What if the thing that unsettles them the most is the moment you stop playing the emotional game? Because when someone can no longer pull you into confusion, guilt, and endless explanations, they lose the control they once had. And that is where your real strength begins. Many people believe challenging a narcissist means confronting them with facts and forcing them to admit what they did. But often, that approach creates a cycle where you keep trying to be understood by someone who may not be focused on understanding you. The deeper challenge is different. It is staying calm when they expect you to react. It is holding your boundary when they expect you to surrender. It is refusing to abandon yourself just because someone else is uncomfortable with your truth. A person with strong empathy does not need to become cold. They do not need to stop caring. They simply learn that compassion without boundaries can become self-destruction. A super empath understands something important. Your kindness is a gift, but your kindness is not an invitation for someone to repeatedly cross your limits. A narcissistic person's biggest discomfort is often not criticism itself, but the feeling that they are losing control over a situation, a conversation, or another person's emotions. Many people assume that the best way to challenge someone with narcissistic traits is to prove them wrong, present evidence, or force them to admit their mistakes. However, what often creates the strongest reaction is when they realize their usual methods of influence are no longer working. Control in unhealthy relationships is not always obvious. It can appear through guilt, blame shifting, emotional pressure, changing the subject, creating confusion, or making another person constantly defend themselves. Over time, the other person may start focusing more on keeping the narcissistic individual satisfied than on protecting their own emotional well-being. The dynamic becomes centered around managing the other person's reactions instead of having a balanced relationship. When someone begins to recognize this pattern, the shift can feel threatening to the person who depended on that control. A simple boundary, a calm disagreement, or a refusal to participate in an argument can challenge the entire dynamic. The narcissistic individual may expect an emotional reaction because strong emotions give them an opportunity to redirect the conversation. Anger, fear, guilt, and desperation can become the focus instead of the original issue. A person with strong emotional awareness learns a different approach. Instead of trying to overpower the narcissistic person, they focus on maintaining their own stability. They do not allow every accusation to become a debate. They do not feel forced to explain every decision repeatedly. They understand that protecting their peace is not the same as avoiding conflict. It is choosing not to participate in destructive patterns. This type of challenge can feel powerful because it removes the reward that comes from controlling another person's emotions. When someone remains calm, communicates clearly, and stays consistent with their boundaries, they demonstrate that their identity and self-worth are not controlled by another person's approval. The goal is not to defeat, embarrass, or change someone else. The goal is to recognize where your responsibility ends and where another person's choices begin. True strength comes from knowing that you can care about someone while still refusing to surrender your emotional safety. When a person learns to stand firmly in their own values, they no longer need to fight for control because they have already reclaimed control over the one thing they can truly manage: themselves. A super empath is often misunderstood because many people think empathy simply means feeling other people's emotions deeply and always putting others first. But true emotional strength is not about absorbing everyone else's pain, fixing every problem, or sacrificing your own needs to keep someone else comfortable. A person with deep empathy becomes more powerful when they learn to combine compassion with awareness, understanding with boundaries, and kindness with self-respect. Many people who are highly empathetic naturally notice small changes in other people's moods, behaviors, and emotions. They may sense when someone is upset, recognize hidden struggles, or understand feelings that are not being expressed openly. This ability can create meaningful connections, but it can also become exhausting when empathy is used without limits. When a person constantly focuses on another individual's emotions while ignoring their own, they may become vulnerable to unhealthy patterns where their kindness is taken advantage of. A super empath does not mean someone who tolerates everything or allows others to repeatedly hurt them. Instead, it describes someone who has developed emotional awareness and learned how to protect their own well-being while still caring about others. They understand that compassion does not require accepting disrespect, manipulation, or repeated emotional harm. One of the biggest changes happens when an empathetic person stops confusing understanding with responsibility. They can understand why someone behaves a certain way without believing they must fix that person. They can recognize another person's pain without carrying it as their own burden. This creates a healthier form of empathy because it comes from choice rather than obligation. When dealing with a narcissistic personality, this kind of empathy becomes especially important. A person with strong emotional awareness may recognize attempts to create guilt, confusion, or emotional pressure, but instead of immediately reacting, they pause and choose a response that protects their values. They do not need to become aggressive or insensitive. Their strength comes from remaining connected to themselves. The most important lesson is that empathy should not require self-abandonment. Caring for others is meaningful, but caring for yourself is equally important. A person who has developed balanced empathy understands that their feelings, needs, and boundaries matter too. True emotional strength is not measured by how much pain someone can endure for others. It is measured by the ability to remain compassionate while also maintaining dignity, clarity, and inner peace. When empathy is guided by self-respect, it becomes a source of resilience rather than a reason to lose yourself. Emotional neutrality is one of the most powerful ways to respond when dealing with someone who constantly tries to create emotional reactions. It does not mean becoming cold, uncaring, or disconnected from your feelings. Instead, it means learning how to manage your emotions so that another person's behavior does not control your responses. This ability allows you to remain focused, calm, and clear even when someone is attempting to create confusion, conflict, or emotional pressure. In unhealthy dynamics, a person may rely on provoking strong emotions from others. They may criticize, blame, exaggerate problems, or create situations where the other person feels forced to defend themselves. When someone reacts with anger, panic, or frustration, the conversation often moves away from the original issue and becomes focused on the emotional reaction itself. This creates a cycle where the person trying to communicate their feelings ends up spending more energy defending their reaction than addressing the actual problem. Emotional neutrality interrupts this cycle. Instead of immediately responding to a provocation, a person learns to observe what is happening and choose their response carefully. They may acknowledge what was said without accepting unfair blame. They may calmly repeat their position without getting pulled into an endless argument. They understand that they do not need to prove their worth or convince someone who is committed to misunderstanding them. This approach can be challenging because many people are taught to believe that strong emotions show how much they care. While emotions are valuable and important, allowing another person to control those emotions can lead to exhaustion and loss of confidence. Emotional neutrality creates space between what happens and how you respond. In that space, you regain your ability to make choices based on your values instead of reacting from fear or frustration. A person who practices emotional neutrality does not ignore problems. They still communicate, express concerns, and set boundaries. The difference is that they do so without giving away their emotional power. They recognize that every conversation does not need to become a battle and every accusation does not deserve their energy. The strength of emotional neutrality comes from self-control and self-awareness. It shows that your peace is not dependent on another person's mood, approval, or reaction. When someone can remain steady in the presence of emotional pressure, they demonstrate that they are connected to their own identity and values. The greatest shift happens when you realize that protecting your emotional balance is not about changing someone else's behavior. It is about choosing how much influence that behavior has over your own life. One of the most important lessons when dealing with difficult or manipulative communication patterns is learning to stop explaining yourself endlessly. Many empathetic people fall into the habit of giving more details, more reasons, and more evidence because they genuinely want to be understood. They believe that if they can just explain their feelings clearly enough, the other person will finally recognize their perspective. However, in certain unhealthy dynamics, more explanation does not create more understanding. Instead, it can create more opportunities for arguments, criticism, and manipulation. Over-explaining often happens when a person feels that their reality is being questioned. Someone may challenge their memory, dismiss their feelings, or make them feel responsible for proving why they made a certain decision. This can create a strong urge to defend every detail. The person begins explaining not because they did something wrong, but because they are trying to regain a sense of being heard and respected. The problem is that endless explanations can shift the balance of a conversation. Instead of two people sharing perspectives, one person becomes responsible for constantly proving their thoughts, emotions, and choices are valid. The conversation becomes less about mutual understanding and more about convincing someone who may not be willing to listen. A healthier approach is learning to communicate with clarity and confidence. You can express your thoughts without turning them into a long defense. A simple statement such as, "This is what I have decided," or "This is how I experience the situation," can be enough. Your feelings and boundaries do not require endless approval from another person to be real. This does not mean refusing to communicate or ignoring another person's perspective. Healthy relationships require openness and discussion. The difference is recognizing when a conversation is productive and when it has become a repeated cycle where you are constantly trying to prove yourself. People with strong emotional awareness understand that their value does not come from winning every argument or receiving agreement from everyone. They know that some people may misunderstand them no matter how carefully they explain. Instead of exhausting themselves trying to change another person's perception, they focus on staying connected to their own truth. The power of reducing over-explaining comes from realizing that confidence does not always need a long explanation. Sometimes the strongest response is a calm, clear statement followed by the ability to stand by it. When you stop feeling the need to justify your existence, choices, and emotions to someone who refuses to understand, you begin protecting your energy and creating healthier emotional boundaries. If this message connects with you, take a moment to reflect. What boundary have you been afraid to hold because you were worried about someone else's reaction? Share your thoughts, because sometimes naming the pattern is the first step toward changing it. Boundaries are one of the clearest ways to understand the health of any relationship because they reveal how people respond when they are faced with another person's needs, limits, and individuality. A boundary is not a punishment, a threat, or an attempt to control someone else. It is a clear statement about what you will accept, what you will not accept, and how you choose to protect your emotional and personal well-being. In relationships with unhealthy patterns, boundaries can create discomfort because they challenge expectations. If someone has become used to having unlimited access to your time, attention, emotions, or energy, they may react negatively when you begin setting limits. The reaction itself can reveal important information about the relationship. A person who respects you may not always agree with your boundary, but they can recognize your right to have one. A person who depends on control may view your boundary as a personal attack. Many people struggle with setting boundaries because they confuse kindness with constant availability. They worry that saying no will make them selfish, difficult, or uncaring. However, healthy boundaries do not destroy relationships. They create the structure needed for respect and trust. Without boundaries, resentment often grows because one person repeatedly ignores their own needs to avoid disappointing someone else. When a person begins establishing boundaries, they may experience resistance. Someone might question their decision, pressure them to change their mind, or attempt to make them feel guilty. This is why consistency is so important. A boundary only becomes meaningful when it is supported by action. Repeatedly stating a limit but allowing the same behavior to continue can create confusion and weaken your confidence. A strong boundary is not about forcing another person to behave differently. It is about deciding how you will respond when certain behaviors occur. You cannot control another person's choices, but you can control your participation, your availability, and your response. For someone with deep empathy, boundaries can feel especially challenging because they naturally understand other people's emotions. They may see another person's pain and immediately want to make things easier for them, but empathy without boundaries can lead to emotional exhaustion and self-neglect. The ability to set boundaries shows that you value both yourself and your relationships. It communicates that connection should not require losing your identity or sacrificing your peace. When someone respects your boundaries, it creates a foundation of mutual understanding. When someone repeatedly fights against them, it provides valuable insight into the nature of the relationship and reminds you that protecting yourself is an essential part of emotional strength. One of the most important things to understand about unhealthy relationship patterns is that a boundary is not truly established by words alone. It is established through consistency. When a person begins setting limits, someone who is used to having control may test those limits to see whether they are serious or temporary. This testing can happen in subtle ways, such as ignoring what was clearly communicated, creating guilt, acting offended, or repeatedly asking for exceptions. A person who relies on controlling dynamics often pays attention to whether your actions match your words. If you say that a certain behavior is unacceptable, but continue allowing it without any change, the other person may learn that the boundary is flexible. This does not mean you need to become harsh or aggressive. It means that your response needs to reflect the importance of what you have communicated. Many empathetic people struggle with this because they naturally want to avoid hurting others. They may explain themselves repeatedly, give multiple chances, or make exceptions because they understand the other person's feelings. While compassion is valuable, constantly changing your limits to prevent someone else's disappointment can slowly weaken your connection with yourself. Consistency creates clarity. When you respond to the same behavior in the same way each time, you communicate that your needs are real and deserve respect. For example, if someone repeatedly speaks to you disrespectfully, a consistent response may involve ending the conversation, creating distance, or refusing to continue engaging until communication becomes respectful. The purpose is not to punish the other person, but to protect your own emotional safety. People sometimes believe that setting boundaries will immediately change another person's behavior. However, boundaries are not tools for controlling others. They are tools for controlling your own choices and actions. Another person may choose to respect the boundary, challenge it, or walk away from it. Your responsibility is not to force a certain outcome. Your responsibility is to remain aligned with your own values. Testing boundaries can also reveal important information about a relationship. A healthy person may need time to adjust, but they usually show a willingness to understand. Someone who repeatedly ignores, attacks, or manipulates your boundaries is showing that they may value access to you more than respect for you. The strength of a boundary comes from the confidence behind it. When you stop changing your limits based on someone else's reaction, you begin building trust with yourself. You learn that your peace, dignity, and emotional well-being are worth protecting. A person who consistently honors their own boundaries sends a powerful message that their kindness does not mean unlimited access, and their empathy does not mean they will abandon themselves. When dealing with someone who displays narcissistic behaviors, it is natural to want to expose the truth, prove your point, or make them finally understand the impact of their actions. Many people spend a great deal of emotional energy trying to reveal contradictions, collect evidence, or win arguments because they believe that if the other person sees the reality clearly, they will change. However, the deeper purpose of protecting yourself is not to defeat another person. It is to maintain your own emotional stability and stay connected to your own sense of truth. Trying to defeat or expose someone can keep you trapped in the same cycle you are trying to escape. It places your attention on their reactions, their approval, and their willingness to admit fault. When your peace depends on another person finally acknowledging what they did, you give them continued influence over your emotional state. Your healing and growth become connected to something you cannot control, another person's awareness or willingness to take responsibility. The more empowering approach is to focus on your own choices. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person understand?" a healthier question becomes, "How can I respond in a way that protects my values and well-being?" This shift moves your attention away from changing someone else and towards strengthening yourself. A person with emotional awareness understands that not every conflict requires a winner. Some conversations are not about finding solutions, but about maintaining power. In those situations, continuing to argue may only create more frustration and exhaustion. Choosing not to engage in endless conflict is not weakness. It is recognizing where your energy is most valuable. This does not mean ignoring harmful behavior or pretending that problems do not exist. It means addressing situations with clarity rather than being consumed by the need to prove something. You can speak your truth, set boundaries, and make decisions without turning your life into a constant battle for recognition. The desire to expose someone often comes from a place of wanting justice and validation. Those feelings are understandable, especially when someone has experienced confusion or unfair treatment. However, real freedom often comes when you realize that your truth does not become valid only after another person agrees with it. The strongest position is not standing over someone else after winning a fight. It is standing firmly within yourself, knowing your values, recognizing your limits, and choosing peace over endless conflict. The goal is not to change someone who refuses to change. The goal is to ensure that their behavior no longer controls the direction of your life. True empathy is often understood as the ability to understand and care about the feelings of others, but genuine empathy also includes the ability to care about yourself. Many people who are naturally compassionate spend so much time recognizing the needs, struggles, and emotions of others that they forget their own needs deserve attention as well. When empathy is practiced without self-respect, it can become a pattern where a person constantly gives while slowly becoming emotionally exhausted. A person with deep empathy may find it easy to forgive, understand, and make excuses for someone else's behavior. They may think about the reasons behind another person's actions and consider the pain that person may have experienced. While this ability to see different perspectives is valuable, it can become harmful when it causes someone to ignore repeated disrespect, manipulation, or emotional harm. Understanding why someone behaves a certain way does not mean accepting every behavior they choose. Empathy for yourself means recognizing that your emotions matter too. It means allowing yourself to feel disappointment, frustration, or hurt without immediately dismissing those feelings because someone else is struggling. Many people are taught to be patient and understanding toward others but are much more critical of themselves. They offer compassion freely to others while believing they must simply tolerate their own pain. A healthy form of empathy creates balance. It allows you to support others while maintaining your own emotional boundaries. You can listen without carrying someone else's entire burden. You can care without becoming responsible for fixing everything. You can offer kindness without sacrificing your own peace. This balance becomes especially important when dealing with difficult personalities or unhealthy relationship patterns. A person who values self-empathy understands that protecting their well-being is not selfish. Taking space, saying no, or stepping away from harmful interactions does not mean they lack compassion. It means they recognize that their own mental and emotional health deserves the same care they provide to others. The strongest empathetic people are not those who tolerate the most pain. They are those who understand that compassion must include themselves. They know that their worth is not measured by how much they can endure, how many people they can save, or how often they put their own needs aside.